Welcome, quietly, into a story that moves like lamplight across old paper. Tonight I will tell you about a small coastal town, about its ordinary routines and its gentle silences, and about one hidden place most people forget exists, a Victorian attic where dust gathers patiently, and where certain things are kept not because they are valuable, but because they are private. It is a story about messages that arrive late, and about the care it takes to hold them with respect. It is also a story about me, though not in any grand way. I am not remarkable. I have simply spent years keeping other people's words safe. And one winter, without quite meaning to, I began to feel the faint return of my own. You will not need to understand everything at once, you only need to step into the mood of it, slow, steady, and warm, like a quiet room at the end of a long day. If you find comfort in stories like this, you are welcome to stay. And if you wish, you may tell me where you are listening from, and whether it is late evening there, or deep night. I like to imagine these stories traveling gently outward, like small lanterns set afloat. There is no hurry now, we will move slowly, we will let the light fall where it may. Outside, the weather never quite becomes rain, and I find that gentle indecision soothing. The air is damp without being sharp, and it carries the faint scent of salt. Wet wool, and a distant thread of smoke that must be drifting down from someone's chimney near the harbor. Far off, a buoy bell rocks and calls to the dark water with a slow, patient note, as if the sea itself is breathing in its sleep. Closer, a window rattles once in the wind, one quick shiver of glass and frame, and then grows still again, as though the house has decided to settle. Indoors, the sounds are steadier, more trustworthy. A small clock ticks with quiet confidence, neither hurried nor dramatic, simply keeping time the way a careful person keeps a promise. Fabric moves when I shift my shoulders or adjust my sleeves, a soft hush that reminds me I am warm enough. And there is the faint, familiar breath of a flame inside an oil lamp, a tiny living thing, contained, watched over, making light without fuss. The lamp does not flood the room, it offers a pool of amber that stops at the edges as if it respects the dark. There is warmth nearest the lamp and coolness at the room's perimeter, the honest kind of warmth that stays close instead of pretending it can fill every corner. I have always trusted that sort of warmth more than the grand, showy kind. It feels like companionship rather than performance. I can hold my hands near it and feel my skin remember ease. I can sit beside it and let my shoulders lower by degrees, not forced, not instructed, simply allowed. If I let my mind settle here, the room becomes easier to enter. The day loosens its grip, finger by finger. The errands and exchanges, the small public manners, the careful attention I pay to other people's needs, those things begin to soften, like ink left too long in rain. Thoughts slow down. They do not vanish, they simply stop insisting on their importance. The body understands what the mind sometimes refuses to admit, that it is permitted to rest. I watch the lamplight touch the rim of my cup, the pale curve of porcelain, the dark surface of tea. I watch it travel across the wood of the table, finding every fine scratch and grain, making even the worn places look gentle. Light, I have learned, does not demand perfection. It only asks for a surface to fall upon, and somewhere underneath the quiet, I feel the beginning of a story taking its first breath, unhurried, steady, warm. It does not arrive like a knock at the door. It arrives like someone drawing a chair nearer to the hearth. It arrives with the smallest shift, the sense that I do not have to brace myself for anything. Nothing is going to leap out. Nothing is going to shout. The tale will simply open, slowly, the way a book opens when the spine has been read many times and knows how to relax, so I let my eyes linger on the lamp's steady glow. I let my feet be heavy on the floor. I let my hands unclench around nothing in particular. I let the room be a room, and the night be a night. And with that simple permission, I feel the threshold appear, the calm doorway between wakefulness and drift, where ordinary life can be observed without urgency, and where the smallest details can become enough. A simple story begins. It was the winter of 1891 when everything began to shift, though at the time I would not have described it that way. I lived then, as I still do, in a Massachusetts harbor town called Hawthorne Bay. It is not a large town, nor a dramatic one. It was built with practical patience, brick and timber, narrow lanes, modest storefronts, and a wharf that creaks like an old shoulder when the tide presses against it. When the tide is high, the water leans close to our edges, as if considering whether to enter. When the tide is low, the mud flats stretch out dark and glistening beneath a thin skin of fog. In winter, that fog arrives early and lingers stubbornly. It softens the outlines of buildings and turns street lamps into small amber halos. It muffles voices, blurs footsteps, and makes the world feel as though it is being held in a gentle, cupped hand. I have always liked that about winter here. It narrows the world without making it smaller. It brings things close. On a side street not far from the harbor, wedged between Mr. Bain's pharmacy and Mr. Halston's notary office, stands the small brick building that houses the post office. Its window bows slightly toward the street, and every evening oil lamps glow behind the glass, steady and dependable. That glow has been my responsibility for years. Inside, the space is modest but orderly. A counter worn smooth by hands. Pigeonholes for sorting letters. A desk at the back where I keep the ledger, heavy, bound in dark green leather, filled with my careful handwriting. The pages record what the town sends outward, letters tied with string, parcels wrapped in brown paper, money orders, notices, and the occasional telegram delivered from the station. I open the office at the same hour each morning. I sweep the floor in patient strokes, shake out the mat so salt grit does not grind into the boards, trim the lamp wicks, and count the stamps. These small actions steady me. They give the day a clear beginning. People in Hawthorne Bay follow rules they rarely speak aloud. We address one another with politeness even when worried. We do not ask private questions unless years of acquaintance have earned that right. We dress according to season and station. We keep our hands to ourselves. The post office fits perfectly within those boundaries. It is a place of order, a place where words are folded neatly into envelopes and entrusted to distance. I stand behind the counter and receive them all. Most people think of me as part of the building. Dependable. Quiet. Always there, upstairs, above the office. I keep a small apartment, one bedroom, one sitting room, a narrow kitchen. The floors are clean, the furniture plain. I own a bookshelf with a handful of worn novels and a chair with a cushion I stitched myself years ago when I still made things simply because I wished to. At night, I make tea and read. Sometimes I open a notebook and consider writing, though lately I have found fewer words than I once did. Mostly, I sleep, the sleep of a conscientious woman whose days belong to other people's letters. My days were made of small duties, and in those days I trusted small duties more than I trusted grand plans. Each morning I opened the post office at the same hour, as if time itself preferred consistency. I turned the key, lifted the latch, and stepped into the familiar scent of paper, lamp oil, and the faint salt that followed everyone in from the harbor. Before the first customer arrived, I swept the floor with careful strokes, not fast, not showy, just thorough enough that the boards looked like themselves again. I shook out the doormat so the grit would not grind into the wood, and I checked the lamps, trimming the wicks so they would burn cleanly and without smoke. Then came the counting. Stamps stacked and sorted, weights set in their places, twine measured, ink topped up, the scale wiped, the stamp pad pressed and tested. I kept the ledger with neat lines and quiet pride. It was heavy, bound in dark green leather, and it recorded what Hawthorne Bay sent out into the world, letters tied with string, parcels wrapped in brown paper, money orders, notices, and, once in a while, a telegram form carried over from the station as if it were a small bird that had flown too hard. There was comfort in that record. It was proof that even an ordinary town could touch the wider world. A letter to Boston, a parcel to Maine, a money order to a cousin who had gone west, thin paper and neat handwriting becoming bridges over distance. I did not pry into the contents. I did not tilt envelopes toward the light, or press my ear to boxes, or ask why a person's hand trembled when they set their words on my counter. My work was not to know. My work was to ensure the knowing could travel safely. The people of Hawthorne Bay lived by rules they rarely named. They spoke politely even when worried. They kept their private questions behind their teeth unless years of familiarity had earned permission. They dressed according to season and station, and they said ma'am and sir with the same steady habit they used to button their coats. In a place like ours, discretion was not merely a virtue, it was a kind of weather, always present, shaping every conversation. The post office fit perfectly within that world. It was a room where order mattered, where words were folded and sealed, where hope and fear could be made tidy enough to send. I stood behind the counter and received it all. Some customers came daily, others only when there was news. Some arrived with the briskness of business, others approached slowly, as if the simple act of mailing a letter required courage. I learned to read the small signs, a pause before a name was spoken, a thumb lingering on a flap, the way a person exhaled after surrendering an envelope, as if setting it down made room in the chest. Upstairs, above the post office, I kept a small apartment with one bedroom, one sitting room, and a narrow kitchen. Nothing grand, nothing wasted. Clean floors. A simple bed. A bookshelf with a few worn novels, their spines soft from rereading. A chair with a cushion I had stitched myself years earlier, back when I still made things purely for pleasure, without needing a reason that sounded practical. At night I made tea and read a little. Sometimes I sat with a notebook tucked in the back of a drawer and turned it in my hands as if it were something delicate. I had once filled pages with observations, small scenes, even fragments of essays I imagined might become real. But over time, my pen had grown heavier, my words fewer. It was not that I had nothing to say. It was that my days were so full of other people's needs that my own thoughts learned to stand quietly in the corner, waiting for a turn that rarely came. Mostly, I slept. It was the sleep of a conscientious woman, deep enough to restore the body, light enough that the slightest sound could pull me back. The sleep of someone who woke at the same hour without an alarm, who could hear a change in the wind through the window frame, who could tell by the creak of a step on the stair whether the person climbing it was hurried or simply cold. In the morning, I rose, dressed, and returned to the counter. I accepted letters. I stamped dates. I tied parcels. I kept words safe, and for a long time, that seemed like a complete life. Hawthorne Bay is small enough that patterns repeat, and in those repetitions I have come to recognize the quiet architecture of our lives. Faces return at regular intervals, voices settle into familiar cadences, and even footsteps seem to carry signatures I can identify without lifting my eyes. Over the years I have learned the rhythm of each person's presence the way one learns the rhythm of the tide. Mr. Baines, the pharmacist next door, comes twice a week without fail. He pushes open the door with measured firmness, as though entering a lecture hall rather than a post office. His coat always smells faintly of wintergreen and alcohol, and he speaks as if delivering instruction, even when purchasing nothing more than a sheet of stamps. He arranges his parcels with mathematical care upon my counter and clears his throat before stating his purpose. I nod, weigh, record, and stamp. We exchange a politeness that has grown almost companionable in its predictability. Then there is Nora Pike, the young seamstress who posts letters to her sister in Providence. Nora keeps her gloves on even indoors, a detail I noticed long ago and have never mentioned. She selects her stamps thoughtfully, as though their small printed faces might influence the tone of her words. When she hands me an envelope, her fingers hesitate for the briefest moment before letting go. I sometimes wonder what she writes, though I would never ask. It is enough to see the care with which she folds her feelings into paper. Old Captain Dyer arrives whenever the weather shifts. He claims he comes for practical reasons, orders, receipts, notices, but I suspect he comes for conversation. He leans one elbow on the counter and tells me how the fog sits differently before a storm, how gulls circle lower when snow approaches, how the harbor remembers every ship that ever entered it. I listen, not because I require instruction, but because he requires an audience. When he leaves, the air seems slightly altered, as if the sea itself had briefly stepped indoors. Mr. Halston, the notary, moves in quieter fashion. He carries documents tied with ribbon and sealed with deliberate precision. His face rarely reveals surprise. He has long since learned how to receive other people's complications without absorbing them. When he speaks, his voice is low and even, and he never lingers. Yet I sense in him a similar devotion to order, a belief that if words are recorded properly, the world will remain upright. There are others too, fishermen with salt in their cuffs, mothers with children tugging at their skirts, boys sent on errands with coins clenched in their palms. They bring complaints about delayed parcels, gratitude for safe arrivals, questions about routes and timetables. They bring their small urgencies and their contained joys. I stand behind the counter and observe without intruding. It is not indifference that keeps me silent. It is respect. I understand that a post office is more than a place of transaction. It is a threshold. People cross it carrying fragments of themselves, trusting that those fragments will travel intact. I am the steward of that trust. Over time, I have noticed how easily one can become invisible while performing such stewardship. To most of Hawthorne Bay, I am part of the room. My presence is assumed, like the scale or the clock. Dependable. Quiet. Always there. There is a certain peace in that invisibility. It frees me from scrutiny. It allows me to move through my duties without spectacle. Yet sometimes, when the office grows still between customers, I feel the faint outline of myself beyond the counter. A woman who once imagined different corridors, different conversations, different horizons. I do not resent the life I have. It is steady. It is useful. But within the repetition of faces and parcels, of stamps and ledger lines, there exists a subtle awareness that I am holding more than mail. I am holding evidence of longing, reconciliation, apology, affection. I am holding the visible shapes of invisible currents that move quietly beneath our town's composed surface. And in holding them, I have learned something about silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is storage. It is the place where unspoken things wait, patient as dust in an attic beam, gathering weight without complaint. Life in Hawthorne Bay is not cruel, but it is narrow, and I have come to understand how a life may be shaped as much by its edges as by its center. In winter, money grows tight. Fishing boats sit idle at their moorings, rocking without purpose. Nets are mended instead of cast. Coal is counted carefully, measured into scuttles as though it were sugar. Shoes are resoled. Sleeves are turned. Hands grow dry from cold water and long work, and no one remarks upon it because it is simply the season doing what it always does. For a woman alone, the boundaries narrow further. It is permitted, certainly, for me to live by myself above the post office. It is even considered respectable, given the nature of my position. Yet respectability comes with quiet instructions. Be modest. Be steady. Be grateful. Do not desire too openly. Do not speak too boldly. Do not draw attention to the fact that you stand without husband or father beside you. I have followed these instructions without resentment, though not without awareness. There was a time when I imagined something wider. When I was young, I dreamed of Boston, its libraries, its lecture halls, its bookshops with tall windows and polished floors. I imagined writing small essays for newspapers, perhaps teaching, perhaps reading aloud in rooms where ideas were passed like cups of tea. I imagined boarding a train simply because I wished to see where it went, watching fields blur into towns I did not yet know. Those dreams were not extravagant. They were simply larger than Hawthorne Bay. Then my father fell ill. The illness was not dramatic, only persistent. It required visits from doctors. Bottles of medicine lined along the mantel, nights of listening for breath that grew thinner with each passing month. My mother, already delicate, became quieter still beneath the weight of worry. The money set aside for my schooling dissolved into prescriptions and coal, into broth and careful warmth. When they died, first my father, then my mother within the year, I found myself standing in a house that felt suddenly too large and too empty at once. There was grief, yes, but there was also arithmetic. Bills. Repairs. The steady insistence of necessity. The post office position was offered not long after. It was practical work. It was reliable. It was respectable. I told myself it would be temporary. A bridge between loss and whatever future still waited. Temporary became years. Years became habit, habit became life. I did not suffer in any dramatic fashion. I was not cast out or diminished publicly. Instead, I learned to fold my ambitions into something smaller and more portable. I learned how to take pride in neat ledgers and punctual deliveries. I learned to find satisfaction in routine. I learned how to make loneliness quiet enough that it did not echo. Sometimes, in the late evening when the lamps burned low and the harbor bell sounded through fog, I felt the faint outline of what I had once wanted. It was not a sharp ache. It was more like the memory of warmth in a room that had cooled. I could recall its presence without quite recreating it. I kept those memories carefully, the way I keep unclaimed letters in a separate drawer, labeled, undisturbed, waiting for a circumstance that may never arrive. There is dignity in practicality. There is grace in endurance. I have always believed that, yet I also know this. When a person spends years safeguarding the words of others, she may forget that her own deserves space upon the page. In Hawthorne Bay, the days continued with their steady rhythm. The tide rose and fell. The fog came and went. The boats returned when the weather permitted. Children grew taller. Storefront signs were repainted. Nothing collapsed. Nothing transformed, and still, beneath the quiet repetition, there remained the subtle weight of the unlived. I carried it without complaint. I carried it the way one carries a sealed envelope tucked safely inside a coat, aware of its presence, uncertain of its contents, unwilling to discard it entirely. Winter days in Hawthorne Bay move in cycles so dependable that my body has learned them without consulting a clock. Morning begins in a gray wash of light that seeps between curtains and settles gently against the walls. I rise before the town fully wakes, dress in layers against the cold, and stand for a moment at my small kitchen window to watch breath form briefly in the air outside. Chimneys begin their quiet work. A baker's boy hurries past with a covered basket. Somewhere, a door closes with soft finality. By 7, I unlock the post office. The scent greets me first: paper, oil, the faint mineral trace of damp wool carried in on coats. I move through my opening rituals with the same careful order each day. Lamps are checked. Wicks are trimmed. The counter is wiped. The scale is tested. I open the ledger and run my fingers lightly across the page where yesterday ended, as if acknowledging a conversation paused rather than concluded. Morning customers arrive in modest succession. A fisherman mailing a note upriver. A mother purchasing stamps while her child studies the brass weights with solemn curiosity. Mr. Baines clearing his throat in practiced fashion. Nora Pike with her gloved hands and lowered eyes. Their voices fill the space without overwhelming it. Each transaction leaves a faint imprint, a small ripple that settles quickly. Midday brings a brief brightening. The harbor shifts from iron gray to pale silver, and for an hour the light in the bow-fronted window appears almost generous. The office grows busier then. Parcels thud gently upon the counter. Coins ring against wood. Ink dries in quick, dark strokes. I weigh, record, stamp, and tie with an attention so consistent it has become almost meditative. My hands know their tasks. My shoulders align with the rhythm of repetition. By afternoon, shadows lengthen again. Fog gathers like soft cloth along the street. I light the lamps earlier than I once did in summer months, watching the flames catch and steady themselves. The room transforms under amber light, edges softening, corners deepening. Conversations quiet. Footsteps slow, evening approaches with a hush, the last customer leaves. The bell above the door gives its familiar jingle. Then rests. I turn the sign to closed and feel a subtle shift inside myself, as though a public mask has been set gently aside. Receipts are tallied. Ledger entries checked and rechecked. Parcels awaiting morning dispatch are arranged in tidy stacks. I do not rush these final tasks. I let them taper naturally, like the end of a long breath. In the back room, I fill the kettle and light the small spirit lamp. Water begins its patient murmur. The stove in the corner requires coaxing. I kneel and tend it with practiced care until flame catches and wood answers with a modest crackle. These are sounds I trust. They do not demand anything of me beyond presence. Tea steeps in a brown pot wrapped in cloth to preserve its warmth. I carry the cup to my desk and sit, feeling the difference between standing for others and sitting for myself. The day's voices fade into memory. The clock resumes its quiet authority. Outside, the harbor bell marks distance in slow intervals. These routines do not excite me, yet they steady something essential. They create a small pocket of time that belongs to no ledger, no schedule, no expectation. Within that pocket, even a life shaped by duty can feel sufficient. Sometimes I remain seated a while longer than necessary, watching lamplight touch the edges of paper, tracing the grain of the desk with my eyes. The world beyond the window narrows into fog and shadow. The room holds its warmth close. Then, when the fire settles and the tea is finished, I climb the stairs to my apartment above, each step creaking softly beneath familiar weight. Another day completed. Another page recorded. Time flows onward, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady as tidewater, carrying me with it whether I resist or not. One evening in late February, the fog arrived thicker than usual, climbing up from the harbor and pressing itself gently against the town as though it wished to listen at every window. The air felt suspended, neither fully cold nor willing to soften. I finished lighting the lamps and returned to my desk with my tea, grateful for the warmth cupped between my hands. The back room had grown comfortable from the stove's steady flame, and for a moment I allowed myself to sit without purpose. It was then that I noticed something out of place. On the sorting shelf, half hidden behind a stack of neatly wrapped parcels, rested a small object I did not recognize. It was not an envelope, nor a paper-bound package. It was a wooden chest, roughly the size of a thick book, dark and smooth as though it had been handled many times. A narrow strip of brass ran along the lid, dulled by age. Twine bound it securely, the knots intricate and deliberate. I stood very still, my mind moved carefully backward through the day, each customer, each signature, each receipt. I could not recall accepting it. That absence of memory unsettled me more than the object itself. The post office was governed by record and repetition. Nothing arrived without passing through my hands. I set my teacup aside and lifted the chest. It had weight, though not enough to strain my arms. Something inside shifted softly when I tilted it, not loose, not chaotic, wrapped, perhaps, in cloth. The sound was subdued, almost polite. I turned it over and found the label, written in a careful, slanted script, to Mrs. Eleanor Waverly, Waverly House, Hawthorne Bay, Massachusetts. I felt my breath pause. Mrs. Eleanor Waverly had been dead for 3 winters. Waverly House stood at the edge of town with its shutters closed and its gate rusted but never locked. The garden had surrendered slowly to bramble and salt wind. No lights had burned in its windows since her passing, yet here, in my hands, rested a chest addressed to her. There was no clear return address. The postmark was faint, blurred beyond easy reading. The twine knots, however, were tied with such care that I sensed intention in them, patient, perhaps nervous, but certain. I carried the chest to my desk and sat with it before me. The stove crackled. The clock ticked. Fog pressed softly against the window, muting the world beyond the glass. The room felt contained, as though holding its breath alongside me. Procedure guided my thoughts. In the morning I would consult records. I would inquire properly. There would be a reasonable explanation, some clerical oversight or delayed routing. The world did not simply bend toward the strange without cause. Still, as I traced my thumb lightly across the wood, I noticed faint markings scratched near the edge, initials, perhaps, or the remnant of someone claiming ownership long ago. The brass lock bore two small keyholes set side by side, an unusual design. It suggested that opening required more than one hand, more than one decision. I did not attempt it. Instead, I placed the chest inside my desk drawer and turned the key with deliberate care. The act felt both protective and deferring. I was not hiding it, I was holding it. That night, sleep did not come as smoothly as usual. I lay in my narrow bed above the office, listening to wind brush against brick and to distant harbor sounds carrying through fog. The presence of the chest below seemed to hum faintly in my awareness, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. In the morning, gray light filtered through my window. I rose and followed my routine without alteration. Porridge eaten standing at the counter. Lamps extinguished outside. The baker's boy passing as always. At 7, I unlocked the office. The scent of paper and oil greeted me faithfully. Letters were sorted. Stamps counted. Customers arrived with their small urgencies, yet beneath every movement, I felt the quiet weight of the locked drawer. The chest waited, not demanding, not accusing, simply present. After that evening, Hawthorne Bay continued as it always did, as if nothing unusual had entered the town's careful rhythm. The post office opened each morning. The lamps were trimmed. The scale was wiped. Letters were sorted into their pigeonholes, and parcels were tied with twine and labeled in my neat hand. People arrived with damp hems and polite voices. They asked after routes, complained softly about delays, thanked me when good news finally reached them. The harbor bells sounded through fog. The tide rose and fell. Smoke lifted from chimneys and thinned into the winter sky. And yet something in me had shifted, quietly, the way a room changes when one object has been moved a few inches from where it used to sit. Nothing looked different at first glance. The counter was still the counter. The ledger still waited on my desk. The day still required its same careful attentions. But my awareness began to open in small, almost unnoticeable ways. I found myself watching hands, not intrusively, simply noticing. The way someone's fingers lingered on an envelope before letting it go, as though the paper contained warmth that might fade once released. The way a young man tried to sound casual while mailing a letter that mattered deeply to him, his voice slightly too light, his posture slightly too stiff. The way an older woman stood a moment longer than necessary at the counter, not speaking, as if human presence could be purchased with stamps and an excuse to ask the time. I had always been careful with the mail. That was my duty. But now I handled each piece with a fraction more gentleness, as though I could feel the quiet weight of what lay inside. It was not curiosity. It was reverence. Words were not merely ink, they were a kind of fragile cargo. A confession folded into a square. A hope pressed flat. A grief sealed tight so it would not leak through seams. Some evenings, when the office grew still and the last lamp in the window cast its amber pool upon the floor, my thoughts returned to the chest in my drawer. Not to its contents, I did not imagine them vividly, and I did not permit myself to speculate too wildly, but to the feeling it had brought into the room. A sense that something unfinished could remain dignified. That a message might arrive too late and still be worth holding with care. I wrote a formal inquiry to Boston, to the estate lawyers listed in the old record books, asking whether any relative remained to receive items addressed to Mrs. Waverley. My handwriting was precise. My tone respectful. When I sealed the envelope, I felt the odd sensation of riding into a current that had already begun moving beneath the surface of my days. The answer, I knew, would take time. Meanwhile the chest remained where I had placed it, locked, accounted for, waiting. At night, I made tea as usual and tended the stove until its warmth settled into the corners. I read my worn novels, though sometimes my eyes moved across the lines without fully taking them in. There was another presence in the room now. Not physical, not intrusive, simply the awareness that my own thoughts were still capable of stirring. One evening, without quite deciding to, I opened the drawer where I kept my old notebook. It had been there for years, tucked behind folded linens, its cover dulled with dust. When I lifted it out, a fine powder clung to my fingertips. The first pages held handwriting from long ago, observations of the harbor, small descriptions of weather, fragments of essays that began confidently and then trailed into nothing. I turned those pages slowly, not with regret, but with the careful curiosity one gives to a younger self. At last I reached a blank page. The paper looked too clean, too unused, as though it did not belong to me. I held my pen above it for a long moment while the stove crackled softly and the clock continued its patient ticking. The room felt very still, but not empty. It felt as though it was making space. I wrote a single line. Then another, nothing grand. No declaration. Just honest noticing. The lamps in the post office window. The way fog softened street lamps into halos. The sound of the buoy bell when the wind shifted. The weight of other people's words passing daily through my hands. As I wrote, my fingers cramped slightly, unused to the sustained motion. I did not mind. The ache felt ordinary, like muscles waking from long rest. I paused, breathed, and continued with a few more lines. When I finally set the pen down, I realized my shoulders had lowered. My breath was slower. The page held evidence, not of talent or ambition, but of return. My words were not gone, they had simply been waiting. The reply from Boston did not arrive quickly. Nothing official ever does. Days passed, then more days, each one slipping into the next with the same familiar pattern. Letters sorted at dawn, parcels weighed at noon, lamps lit early in the afternoon as winter tightened the light. I continued writing in my notebook some evenings, not as a duty, but as a small private practice, the way one might water a plant that has survived long neglect and is quietly, stubbornly alive. The chest remained in my locked drawer. I did not forget it, yet I learned how to let it rest in the background of my mind without pulling my attention taut. I told myself I was behaving properly. I had recorded its existence. I had secured it. I had initiated inquiry. That was, after all, what a conscientious person was meant to do. Then, one afternoon, as 4 o'clock drew near and the last pale strip of daylight began to thin at the window, the bell above the door jingled and a man stepped inside. He paused just within the threshold, as though acclimating to the room's warmth. He was perhaps 50, tall and lean, with a coat that had been well made and well cared for, though the cuffs showed wear. His hair was iron gray, combed back with patient habit. He removed his hat carefully and held it in both hands for a moment, not fidgeting, simply grounding himself. "Good afternoon," I said. "Good afternoon," he replied, and his voice was quiet, measured, as if he had practiced restraint for many years. He looked at me without staring. His gaze moved over the counter, the pigeonholes, the lamps, as though searching for something familiar that he could not quite name. "My name is Caleb Waverley," he said at last. "I was told you might have something for my family." It was not a dramatic line. He did not speak it with a flourish. But the air in the room seemed to sharpen, as if my attention had been drawn into a single clear point. I felt the locked drawer in my mind the way one feels a key in a pocket. I nodded once. I did not ask him to repeat himself. Instead I reached beneath the counter, retrieved the key, and opened the drawer with slow care. When I lifted the chest out and set it between us, its brass strip caught the lamplight and held it for a moment like a held breath. Caleb did not reach for it. He stood very still, looking down, and something crossed his face. Recognition, yes, but also the quiet fatigue of a person encountering a door he had tried not to notice. After a moment, he moved to the chair I kept for older customers and sat, placing his hat on his knee. He rested his hands there, palms down, as though steadying himself against a faint tremor. "I didn't know my aunt well," he said softly. "Not in the way a person wishes they had. She was quiet. The house was quiet. And people thought quiet meant empty." I listened without interrupting. The post office had taught me that some things arrive best without being hurried. Caleb spoke in small, careful pieces. He had come to Hawthorne Bay to settle what remained of the Waverley estate, papers, inventories, the slow legal work that follows a death even years later. In the process, he had begun opening rooms that had been left untouched, and climbing into spaces where time had gathered patiently. The attic, he said, was full of trunks and covered furniture, of sheet music tied with ribbon, of boxes labeled in Eleanor's hand. "She kept everything," he murmured, almost with tenderness. "Not out of hoarding. Out of privacy." His gaze returned to the chest. The two keyholes seemed to stare back, quiet and uninsistent. "I did not bring that here," he added after a pause. "I want to be clear. I didn't carry it to your counter. But when I found the old letter, when I realized something had been sent to her, I thought it would come through the post. Through record. Through someone who understands what it means to hold words safely." He looked up then, briefly, and his eyes held the simple sincerity of that statement. I felt, in response, something unexpected, not pride, exactly, but a gentle acknowledgement that my steadiness had mattered more than I had known. "I haven't opened it," Caleb said. "I don't think I should. Not alone." The room remained calm. The clock continued. The lamp flames did not flicker. And yet I sensed we had arrived at the edge of something private, something that required the same respect as a sealed envelope. I folded my hands on the counter. "Then we won't," I said quietly. Caleb's shoulders eased a fraction, as if he had been waiting for permission to leave a door closed without shame. They did not open the chest that evening. Instead, Caleb asked if I would walk with him to Waverly House, to return it to the attic where so many of Eleanor's quiet belongings still rested. Dusk had already settled, and the fog moved softly along the street as we stepped outside together. The town felt hushed, as though aware of our small procession, our shared errand made not of urgency but of care. Inside the house, the air was cool and faintly scented with old wood and long-closed rooms. Caleb carried a lantern, I carried the wrapped chest against my coat. We climbed the narrow stairs carefully, boards murmuring beneath our weight, each step a small acknowledgement of time passing. In the attic, dust lay undisturbed, pale in the lantern light, like memories settled into corners. He placed the chest within a trunk beside bundled sheet music and folded linens. We did not speak. Some things are honored best by silence. Thank you for lingering with me in that quiet Victorian attic, where dust drifted like slow snowfall and time rested gently inside a locked wooden chest. If this gentle journey through lamplight, silence, and forgotten corners brought you a sense of calm, you're warmly invited to like and subscribe for more peaceful stories that unfold softly in the dark. May you carry with you the hush of old floorboards, the faint scent of aged paper, and the comforting mystery of things kept safe until the right moment. Sleep deeply, keep your quiet sense of wonder, and let the stillness of that attic, patient, steady, and kind, settle around you as you drift into peaceful dreams.